listener production.
Hey, Chris Speary with you and welcome to The Briefing. This election campaign has been filled with drama, from investigations into content creators to alleged criminal activity and even targeted pamphlet drops threatening to expose a candidate. And where there's been fire, the body tasked with finding out who stoked the flame, or whether it's all just smoke and mirrors, is the election watchdog, or the AEC.
We're not the internet police. We're not the truth police even. There is freedom of political expression in Australia and people can say what they like. But it's really important to assist the voter for them to know where the communication is coming from.
What the Australian Electoral Commission actually does is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy. It's Thursday, the 24th of April.
Good morning, Chris, and to you listening, happy Thursday. Now, Peter Dutton and the Coalition have come under fire for what appears to be another backflip just over a week out from the federal election, this time relating to electric vehicles. Now, just 2 days after the opposition leader said he would not touch Labor's tax break on EVs, the Liberals have walked back that statement, saying it would be scrapped. Now, this follows previous backflips, including the party's plan to axe work from home in the public sector, as well as announcing it was going to get rid of the country's world-leading right to disconnect laws introduced by Labor, which allows workers to refuse to monitor, read or respond to work comms outside paid hours unless reasonable.
Yeah, and experts have since come out criticising that decision, saying it's vital and helps reduce employee burnout and stress. Now, at a press conference in Western Australia yesterday, the opposition leader also unveiled his long-awaited defence policy alongside Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, announcing a record investment of $20 billion over 5 years into defence, almost doubling what Labor has pledged.
At this election, there is a choice for Australians to make. On the one hand, you've got a government that has ripped $80 billion out of defence. On the other, the Coalition is investing more into defence, a record amount of money, and we're keeping our country safe doing so.
Dutton also touted $90 million in funding for tackling domestic violence and plans to introduce a national database for DV offenders.
And at this same press conference, we also heard that if elected, the Coalition would not be following suit on Labor's plan to cut 20% of student debt, with the opposition previously labelling it elitist and unfair. Now, meanwhile, on the Labor side of the campaign trail yesterday, the PM announced plans for a national stockpile of minerals, which are needed for things like computers, military equipment and electric batteries, which are in high demand globally. Now, $1.2 billion would be spent on holding things like rare earths, nickel, lithium, graphite, in a bid to try and have Australia not be reliant on other countries like China for supplies.
Tech juggernauts Apple and Meta have been fined hundreds of millions by the European Union, marking the first sanctions handed out under new landmark digital anti-competition legislation. A lot of words there, Tara, but stick with me. The maker of the iPhone, Apple, copping an $880 million fine for preventing users from accessing cheaper third-party app stores, as the EU had requested them to do last year, something Apple says is bad for the privacy and security of users and forces them to give away their tech for free.
Meanwhile, Meta has been slapped with a $356 million fine for forcing Facebook and Instagram users to choose between seeing ads or paying to avoid them. And the European Commission says both companies have essentially taken away the free choice of its users. And the tech giants, though, have said they will appeal that, Apple accusing the EU of unfairly targeting them and constantly moving the goalposts, making compliance near impossible, while Meta has said it's trying to handicap successful American businesses.
Yeah, and on that point and that rhetoric, there was a lot of reports coming out saying that this was a year-long investigation and the findings and the ultimate fine was delayed a few months, given how tumultuous relationships are with the US at the moment and, you know, the hovering, looming threat of tariffs being thrown left, right and centre. So it's interesting seeing the EU coming out so hard here in this space. And look, this all comes just 2 days after that spicy the third leaders debate between Albo and Dutton, where we actually got a rare show of bipartisanship on cracking down on big tech. Both leaders in that debate on Channel 9 saying they were committed to forcing companies like Meta and Google to continue paying Australian outlets for news, and seeing the world-first social media ban for minors coming into effect in this country at the end of the year. While we'll wait to see whether these appeals are successful in the EU, we are seeing a global shift towards cracking down on big tech. So, like we always kind of say on this show, let's watch this space.
To New South Wales now, where a Sydney man will front court today after being charged over a major data breach of the state's court website. It was first discovered last month that the New South Wales Civil and Criminal Online Registry had been compromised, seeing almost 9,000 sensitive documents, including AVOs, affidavits, and potentially sensitive information about child victims leaked. The 38-year-old man's home was raided yesterday morning, with police seizing 2 laptops before arresting and charging him with accessing and modifying restricted data.
He was also charged on an outstanding warrant for using a carriage service to menace, harass, or offend. Authorities say the matter is contained and no information has been detected on the internet or dark web yet. Operative word, yet.
Yet. And I find this really interesting because I've spoken with a number of cyber criminal experts in the past, and basically one of the big things they say is it is an incredibly hard space to police and enforce, and something like 1% of cyber crimes are actually solved. So to see them find someone responsible and put them before the courts is really interesting and great.
Now, we've heard lots about our supermarkets, price gouging, and our poor farmers in recent months, but it turns out it's not just the grocery giants being called out, it's also Bunnings. Last year, the hardware giant was called out in the ACCC's supermarket inquiry over its treatment of plant growers, who said they were operating at a loss and terrified to make a complaint against them, calling for a code of conduct for protection.
And the government's backed it, saying Bunnings does need to act quickly or face strict regulations, and Bunnings has since signed a statement with plant suppliers intending on improving work conditions, with growers saying while it's an important step, they aren't convinced that it's going to solve the issue as it's a voluntary agreement. It's due to take effect in coming weeks, but I guess a bit of food for thought for when you're next off to buy some tools or plants for the yard. I definitely know that I spend the most amount of money at Bunnings. I have 2 within a kilometre of my house. So come on, Bunnings, I want to see you do the right thing here.
Yeah, and look, you're not alone in that. Like, Bunnings is very much a staple of this country and it's very much ingrained in our culture. And that was really the subject of a 2-part deep dive that Sasha did. It was interesting because she was speaking to a consumer expert about how Bunnings managed to get their grip hold on the market. But she also spoke to the managing director of Bunnings about what they do with all that responsibility. So very fascinating. We'll drop that in the show notes. Definitely worth a listen today.
And our favourite viral twinnies are continuing to go global, landing an interview last night with late-night great Jimmy Kimmel.
Joining us now from Queensland, Australia, Bridget and Paula Powers. Hello, Bridget and Paula. You really are twins. Well, you've caused quite a commotion with this video. When did you become aware that you had delighted the globe?
Well, when we heard from your show.
Oh, they're so cute. And look, if you were wondering yesterday, like a lot of us were wondering whether this is an act or whether this is actually real, whether the twinnies do this, we have a deep dive, which is definitely worth a listen.
Yeah, Tash spoke to a twin expert, essentially delving into everything twinning, twin telepathy. And I found it so interesting. Basically, we even had a twin in one of our meetings yesterday saying, this is a thing. Sometimes we'll be thinking about texting each other and you see the 3 little dots coming up. So definitely worth a listen if you're interested in this space. But look, for today's deep dive, that's my chat that's coming up next with the watchdog that has been front and centre of the biggest election headlines in recent weeks, why we have them, some of their new rules around social media, and unpacking some of those biggest investigations as of late. So have a listen to that one up next. This election campaign, there has been a lot of talk about political content. who made it, and who paid for it, so you know whether what you're hearing is advertising and needs one of these.
Authorised P. Erickson, ALP Canberra.
Authorised A. Hurst, Liberal Party Canberra.
Authorised by J. McCall, Australian Greens, Canberra.
Or if it's just someone's opinion. And the ones making that call are the Australian Electoral Commission, or the AEC, who've investigated a number of incidents in recent weeks, from an interview with the PM by a podcaster to a content creator's collaborative posts paid for by an MP, to just this week, nearly 50,000 unauthorised pamphlets calling out a candidate for being weak on anti-Semitism. Eakin-Smyth is a spokesperson for the AEC and is here to help us unpack it all. Evan, thanks so much for joining me on The Briefing. I don't think I've ever seen the AEC in the news headlines as much as the last few weeks. Is this usual, or has this been a particularly interesting election campaign?
No, it's pretty standard for the AEC. Obviously, we've become particularly topical during an election period, and lots of people want to talk to us about different campaigning materials that are going around, even the enrolment process, who's becoming a candidate and things of that nature. Perhaps the thing that's a little bit different is maybe the modes of campaigning that's occurring this time around. There does seem to be a rise in online modern channels of communication and their involvement in the political scene. So influencers, podcasters, things of that nature, does seem to be a bit more involved this time around.
How has that change in modern media impacted the AEC's role? And what does it mean in terms of what you guys can and can't do?
Well, it's put us on TikTok, for one. I don't know if anybody's seen our account, and I apologise for the videos that feature me. And it also means that with some of these channels that aren't specifically covered by the Electoral Act in terms of our authorisation statements that people have to put on communication, it's made it a little bit complex to make sure that people know where the communication's coming from.
And for people that might not know, can you explain why the AEC exists? What is it that you're needed for?
Run the election. I think sometimes when people are looking at campaigning material and focusing in on other things, they forget that our core job is to run the election. We maintain one of the best, most complete electoral rolls in the world, and then we provide voting options. Again, some of the best in the world. If you look at some systems overseas, you got your name on a particular door at a particular time, and that's your only option to vote. In Australia, you got thousands of polling places, hundreds of early voting centres, mobile polling going into remote communities, going into nursing homes, homeless shelters, prisons and the like. We do telephone voting for people who are blind or have low vision, also people who are in Antarctica. It's really complex to run the election. And then, of course, counting the votes. Make sure they're counted in a fully transparent way that people can trust.
And part of it has been also monitoring electoral matter, or the kinds of things that are out there relating to the election. And there's been some new rules that we introduced relating to kind of social media and influencers. Why do we need these rules around what content creators post and electoral matter more broadly? What do we run the risk of if we don't make sure they're clearly labelled?
Yeah, well, the system, the regulation rather, really is just about making sure that people know who is the source of the communication. So we're not the internet police. We don't want to be the internet police. We're not the truth police even. People can campaign freely. There is freedom of political expression in Australia, and people can say what they like. And then it's up to the voter to determine what they make of that before they go to the ballot box. But it's really important to assist the voter for them to know where the communication is coming from. So if there's some anonymous communication, obviously it makes the job harder to determine what you think of that piece of material. So that's why there's laws around making sure that there's authorisation statements, that quick little statement you hear on the end of videos or ads, or potentially written at the bottom of a press advertisement or a poster. That's so that people know who's behind it. And a lot of the conversation with modern forms of media has been about whether or not there's been a paid relationship between a political party and an influencer or a podcaster. Are they paying for that content? Because really that's something should be transparent in terms of knowing where the communication is coming from. Is it someone's genuine views that they're putting forward, or is it something that's paid for? So that's what those statements are about.
And we have seen this really huge reaction to the whole saga around political content and influencers or content creators, the need for there to be really clear rules around how they post. Yet we still don't have laws in place at a federal level to ensure there is truth in political advertising itself. Do you think it's hypocritical?
It's a really tricky topic. I mean, there's modern communication channels, sure, and communication moves very, very quickly these days. Being the arbiter of truth is not something that the AEC necessarily wants to be. Any decision around that in a heated political environment just ahead of the poll that we actually run could have assertions attached to it about bias or how we're leaning one way or the other, which of course we don't. Neutrality is at the core of what we do. The other thing is it's not always clear. Truth can be in the eye of the beholder. Things aren't necessarily black and white about what is truth and what is not. So nothing's changed in that regard at the moment, but it might. Parliament did introduce truth in political advertising laws into Parliament just prior to the 2025 federal election, but they haven't been passed. Whether or not that debate comes up again, it's interesting, if truth in advertising laws do eventually pass Parliament post-election or in the future sometime, is the AEC the body that administers that? How deep do those laws go in terms of what can be determined as true or false? Is it restricted to certain bits of material or is it a bit more open? Big conversation and not as simple as people think.
Now, there was one big investigation recently relating to a podcast, Abby Chatfield, that the AEC became involved in, and it was raised during Senate estimates. I wanted to ask, what actually prompted the AEC to start investigating that? Did it just hear about it or did it receive a complaint?
Yeah, well, it was raised in Senate estimates with us, so that was one forum, but we did receive a letter as well asking us to look into that matter, and we did, and we determined that the material in question didn't require an authorisation, so there was no issue there. We get asked about a range of communications during an election period and whether or not they need an authorisation, they have the right sort of authorisation, and we look into anything that's raised with us because we have to. It's the law that we regulate. On that particular issue, a little bit complex because the Electoral Act doesn't deal with these sorts of or methods of communication specifically, so it took us a little bit to get into that particular subject matter and make a determination. The other thing about this as well, a lot of people have said about the focus, I suppose, on that particular podcaster or influencer and why we're looking at that and not others. Well, we are looking at others. We don't make determinations about what people focus on or how much airtime people give particular issues. We can't help how other people frame those things as well. We look at everything equally with a consistent lens. We're simply looking at the law, and if people ask us a question about the law and how it applies to a certain bit of material, we look at that and we provide an answer.
And that same investigation did actually end up prompting these new rules around social media. Are you able to share them with me?
Yeah, not necessarily new rules, just clarification of advice for people who are communicating, because the laws haven't changed. But we did provide some increased advice for people. And it was about podcasting and influencers, but it was also about if you do need to potentially authorise or not when you're cross-posting. The really clear, hard and fast rule is if you're a political entity and you're communicating about the election, so if you're a candidate, a political party, you need to authorise your material. Or if you're paid for this thing, or if you're paying to promote it, so if it's advertising, then you need to authorise your material. Payment is not necessarily about money exchanging hands for services. It can actually be gifts in kind. So if potentially travel or accommodation or whatever it is, some form of service has been paid for, and it's an arrangement that's directly for certain communication to be made, that's potentially a gift in kind.
Now, since that particular incident, there's been another social media-related election saga that's erupted after it came out that independent candidate Allegra Spender paid content creators for some social media posts. Now, they were authorised but not marked as paid, and that caused a little bit of concern around transparency. And I understand that the LNP wrote to the AEC about it and that the AEC since released a statement saying any such content that's paid for by a politician, like you said, should be clearly labelled as paid. Has it come to any conclusions, though, around Allegra Spender's posts?
Yeah, my understanding is our team's still looking at that one and whether or not we need evidence, of course, as to whether or not there has been payment made, and if so, if it was conditional on certain communication being done or if there was still free will in that communication. It's interesting with a lot of these matters as well, though. I don't necessarily think that some people are in doubt about the source or what the intentions of certain people are. So it did say that it was in collaboration with that particular individual. So we're just looking at the specifics and whether or not it met the technical requirement.
And off the back of both of these different incidents, there has been some, critics that have given accusations toward the AEC of being a bit of like a toothless tiger in terms of not being able to do much, even if there was something found to be an issue. For example, if someone was found to be kind of breaking any rules or guidelines, it would essentially just be a slap on the wrist, please remove the post, don't do it again type thing. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, it really depends on the nature of what the material is and the nature of the potential breach of the Electoral Act. We do take an educative approach, particularly with areas of modern media that are complex and the Electoral Act isn't really specific about. So educative approach first, but not always. People have been taken to court in the past for authorisations matters and a range of other things to do with electoral communication. There is a section of the Act about misleading communication about the voting process itself as well. So there's a range of potential ramifications there that can start at the not very severe, but can go to the severe as well. I mean, we've had a former politician in court with us just in the last couple of weeks over an authorisations matter. So there are potential ramifications there for sure.
Okay, that's good to know. Outside of social media, what other kinds of issues have been raised this election campaign that the AEC's had to get involved in?
There's always things to do with campaign signage that people raise with us, being vandalism, potentially people taking other people's campaign signage. There's been some elements of hate speech, the involvement of bots online and who's potentially directing those. There's a range of things, but I don't think anything's really surfacing as really significant issues at the moment. We think Australians are ready to cast their vote.
And Evan, to wrap up, if the AEC had the power to change one thing tomorrow relating to elections, politicians and the kind of political content that's out there, what would it be?
Maybe the postal vote applications that are distributed by third parties. We want voters to be able to make decisions with good information about what they do with their details for privacy reasons. We really want people to come directly to us for postal votes if they need it. Political parties are exempt from the Privacy Act. The AEC isn't. So if somebody fills out a postal vote application that's been distributed to them by a political party, the reports are that political parties use those to take the people's details before they forward them on to us to ultimately service the postal vote. It can be misleading for voters. So it's something that we've raised on a number of occasions. So it's probably something that we'll raise again into the future.
Wonderful, Evan. Thank you so much for joining me on The Briefing.
Not a problem.
That was Evan Eakin-Smyth speaking with me there about all the work and investigations the AEC's been involved in this election campaign. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If you found this ep interesting, we would love it if you could share it with someone else who you think might too, or perhaps our social posts. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.